Hello, it's Monday. Welcome to another chapter of Saving the Unicorn's Horn. Running a bit late today. I feel like I've been chasing my tail all day. We've gone back to homeschool today, like I expect some of you have, and trying to get 3 children, one in Key Stage 1, one in Key Stage 2, and one effectively in Key Stage 3, doing stuff all at the same time, I'm not doing so well at it. So I've just been puzzling over how to do a better job. Anyway, I think I talked to my mum, who used to be a teacher before she retired, and she came up with some suggestions. So tomorrow it's going to be a new, fresh start, and we're going to achieve loads, and it's going to be brilliant. Oh yeah. I was also supposed to go to the post office, haven't done that either. So yes, slightly chasing my tail today, but never mind, I'm sure it's all fine. Light on in here looks slightly weird today. I don't know if I got something on the camera lens. Oh, it would be this camera lens, won't it? Not sure. Think it's okay. Anyway, what you really need is to be able to hear me, not see me. So, chapter 6. Yay. Where are we? I'm trying to think what's just happened. Ah, yes. So they've been to the Jorvik Centre, and they've just got on this sort of ride thing, which I've been on in the Jorvik Centre, which takes you through a reconstructed village. And they've just done that, or they've just gone on, and Joe's really hoping he's going to be able to get off and find himself somehow back on Lucy's street, because the Jorvik Centre is actually built right on top of where she used to live. It's on the right street. He knows that. It's called Coppergate, and it's this street of the Coopers. So he's really, really hoping it's going to work. Let's see if it does. Chapter 6. Sam was still brimming with enthusiasm for the Jorvik Centre while they were having lunch some time later. "That skeleton at the end of the museum was awesome," he said for the umpteenth time. 16 wounds! Get that! The axe in his leg, the stab wounds, the wounds on his arms while he was trying to defend himself with his sword, and then the execution wounds. It was so cool." Joe was about to tell his brother to shut up, but Sam had fortunately stopped talking. Perhaps he'd finally realised how horrible it was to get so excited at the thought of someone being murdered. What was the matter with his imagination, Joe wondered. It had been obvious while they were looking at the skeleton that his brother wasn't seeing this poor man in the last minutes of his life. Joe had pictured him quite clearly, kneeling on the ground. The 16 injuries on the skeleton didn't include cuts that had only gone into his flesh, so blood had probably been streaming out of him. He'd knelt there in front of his enemy, knowing he was about to die, just waiting for the blow to the back of his head that was going to end his life. What were the last thoughts that had gone through the skull they were looking at? He might have been as young as 18, the archaeologists said. Joe felt sure he'd been thinking of his mother. He must have been full of grief that he would never see her again. And surely he'd been frightened too at the thought of his own death. Joe knew he would be. He'd found it both horrifying and terribly sad. Of course, he'd been feeling rather sad anyway. They'd been right at the end of the museum by then, and he hadn't found a way to get back to Lucy. There had been no possibility of climbing down from the car on the ride because the bar was so tight across their laps. And though the reconstruction of the Viking street had been interesting and reasonably accurate, the waxwork figures weren't real people. The voices recorded for them spoke a language he didn't understand, and the narrator kept talking about Coppergate as the street of the cup makers rather than the Coopers, as Lucy had called it. As for the smells of Viking life, there had been a faint waft of something now and then, but nothing like as bad as the real thing. On balance, he thought, that was probably just as well. He found he was smiling. Even he couldn't bring himself to long for the stink of Lucy's Jorvik. Lying in bed that night, however, He thought hard about Lucy. He had once found himself whisked into her time while he was waiting to go to sleep, so it wasn't impossible. A few times he thought he heard the telltale hiss that always seemed to fill his ears as he slipped between worlds. But each time he held his breath to listen, it turned out to be a distant car, or the wind, or nothing at all. He wished he'd told Lucy how he thought the St. Christopher worked, by her holding it and thinking of him at the same moment as he thought of her. But he'd just put it round her neck and not said anything about it. Eventually he fell asleep. Dad woke him and Sam early the next morning. "Get dressed, please, and sort out your breakfast. We need to pack the last few things and do a basic clean-up before we leave. Our train's in 2 hours. Sam moaned sleepily. Joe sat up. 2 hours. In 2 hours they would be gone from York. While he helped Dad with the washing up, he could feel a growing sickness in his stomach. He wasn't ill, he knew. This was how it always was when he was unhappy about something. He tried to work out whether it was because it was the end of the holidays, and therefore the end of their time with Dad, or whether it was because he felt like he was leaving Lucy. That was silly, of course. You couldn't leave someone who wasn't there. They arrived at the station with 10 minutes to spare. Joe sat hunched up between Dad and Sam on the platform bench. He could feel the cold metal of the seat through his jeans. None of them spoke. Dad was reading the paper, and Sam's eyes were glued to the screen of his phone while his thumbs stabbed at it with frantic little movements. Joe stared miserably into space. After a while, there was a whispering along the rails. He looked up. The train was just coming past the signal points outside the station. He stood up. Dad folded his paper and got to his feet. "Come on, Sam," he said. "We don't want to leave you behind." Sam stood up, not taking his eyes off his phone. The train swung along the track and in beside the platform, creeping along until it came to a stop. "I wouldn't mind leaving you behind," thought Joe. "You're so boring, wrapped up in that thing every second you're allowed. Given the choice between you and Lucy, I'd leave you behind quite happily and take her." There was a hiss as the doors opened. Joe took hold of the handle of his pull-along bag. The hissing grew louder and louder. He swayed, feeling slightly dizzy, and steadied himself on the nearest thing. It was the wattle construction in the yard behind Lucy's house. He screwed his eyes shut and then opened them again. The station had completely melted away. The smell of rubbish and decay was in the air again, and the scent of wood smoke from the roofs above. He waited, bewildered, for the dizziness to pass. The trouble with the way this time slip happened was that it never seemed to be when he was ready. So he always felt as though he was caught out. He rubbed his eyes and tried to work out what time it was. It was only just light, so it must be quite a bit earlier than it had been in his own world. That was another thing about moving into Lucy's world from his own. It seemed as though time passed at a different rate, so the time of day and season only matched when he first went. When he'd gone back to Fishbourne the second time, it had been night at home but day there, and in Lucy's world it had already been autumn, where it was still summer in his own time. Here, now, it was presumably around dawn, and much colder than at home. Only 4 days had gone by in his world, but it seemed that weeks or even months might have passed here. He patted his cloak to see if he was wearing any extra layers, but his clothes felt the same as before. He shivered. The only thing he could rely on was that he would reappear in the same spot he had disappeared from. That was how it had been before, and again, this time, he was standing exactly where Thorbjorn had pinned him with his back against the wattle. He glanced around, to be sure the older boy wasn't still here, but the yard was empty. He pulled his cloak tight around him and stepped away from the wattle screen. The pig pen down at the end of the yard looked as though it was empty, but he could hear a gentle clucking sound from the chicken coop up near the house. Perhaps Thorbjorn had been so alarmed by his disappearance that he decided to leave the chickens. Joe very much hoped so. The back door of the house opened. He froze. If this wasn't Lucy coming out, it might be better to hide. But it was already too late. If he moved, he would draw attention to himself. He would just have to stand very still and hope the person wasn't heading for the cesspit right behind him. A girl stepped out. Joe peered at her. She carried a bucket in one hand and a stool in the other, and she had a hood over her hair. It looked like Lucy, going to milk the goat, but he had to be sure he hadn't mixed her up with Anya or Sorka before he approached. He watched her fetch hay from the feed basket and then fix the strap around the animal's back legs. Then she sat down on the stool, making soothing, murmuring noises. It was definitely her. "Psst," he whispered. At once she turned her head. "Psst," he whispered again. "It's me, Joe." She spun round on the stool. The goat stamped at her sudden movement. "Joe?" Her eyebrows were drawn together and she looked anxious. Joe walked quietly up the yard towards her. "Hello, Lucy," he said softly. "Lucy?" She looked confused. "Oh, yes, that's what you called me before. Where did you spring from?" She was still frowning. "I came back as soon as I could," he said, ignoring the question. "Sorry I didn't manage to say goodbye before I went." She shook her head. "I don't think it's a very good idea for you to be here." "Oh." He knew he sounded crestfallen. "At least not until we've had a chance to talk." "Okay." "Okay? I mean, all right, but can't we talk while you milk the goat?" "Someone might come out. You can meet me at that end of the lane later on." She gestured past the house. "After breakfast, when I go out for firewood." "All right. How do I get out from here?" "Well, how did you get in?" "Oh, never mind. Will I be able to squeeze down the side of the house?" Lucy pulled a face. "If you don't mind what you're treading." Joe grimaced. But the alternative would be to try and climb over the fence to the next yard, and then the next, and risk breaking the fences or getting caught. He would have a hard time explaining what he was doing on someone else's property, and if he was already suspected of stealing chickens, as Thorbjorn had intended, that could be a very bad move. "Right." He tiptoed towards the narrow passage between Lucy's house and the neighbours'. "I'll see you down there later on." It seemed a very long time until Lucy reappeared. Of course, it might easily have been as much as 2 hours, he realised, judging by how late breakfast had been last time he was here. Joe had thought he wasn't hungry, certainly not for Aileen's lumpy porridge, but his stomach started to rumble while he waited. At home it would be time for elevenses. He drifted around. There wasn't any kind of bench or low wall he could sit on, and the ground was still filthy, even though the water in the ruts was frozen. Around him, craftsmen opened up their workshops for the day, many of them moving their benches out into the street to make the most of the dull daylight. At last he saw Lucy coming towards him, carrying the same baskets as she'd done before. He was about to speak, but she shook her head and motioned to him to follow her further away from the house. They were at the gates of the city where he'd first seen her, before she stopped to let him catch her up. "You decided to come back then?" she said, as they walked out together through the gates into the countryside beyond. "We thought you'd gone." She sounded reproachful. "I'm sorry, I'm sure you did. I can't seem to help it." "Right." It was clear from her voice that she didn't believe him. She shrugged her shoulders as though she didn't care anyway. "I didn't take your chickens, though," he said. "Why would I think you did? Didn't they get stolen?" "No." Jo sighed in relief. "That's great." She looked at him. "I don't understand you. First you vanish into thin air, and then, when you suddenly turn up again, you're really happy about something that didn't happen." Jo laughed. She was right, in a way. "That night," he said, "your mother sent me out to the yard with the moss, remember?" "Yes, and you didn't come back. We even lit a reed taper and took it out there to see if you'd fallen into the cesspit. But you'd gone, without bothering to say goodbye or thank you or anything. Thorbjorn was out there when I went out." He saw her muscles tense instantly. Her eyes were fixed on a spot just ahead of her, but he could see that he had her full attention. "He was about to steal your chickens." "And you stopped him? That was brave," she exclaimed. "Not exactly." Jo was reluctant to correct her, but she had to know the truth. "He said he was going to do it, and he would make sure that I got the blame. But I said I wasn't going to let that happen, and he put a knife to my throat." Lucy's eyes were like saucers. "What happened then?" "I disappeared." He blushed. It sounded so lame. "You disappeared?" she repeated slowly. "What do you mean?" "Exactly how it sounds. One minute I was standing there in the yard with Thorbjorn's blade on my neck, and the next minute I was back in my own world. I guess Thorbjorn was left looking at empty space." She stopped walking. "Are you talking about magic?" "Sort of, I suppose." Jo turned to face her. "I don't really know what it is, but magic would be one way of describing it." She brightened. "Can you make spells, then? And put curses on people?" "No, it's not that kind of magic. And like I said, I can't control it." Her face fell. Jo felt a twinge of regret that he was disappointing her. "I told you when we met that I came from a long way away. Well, it is quite a long way away, geographically, but what I really meant is that it's another time in history." "Another time? Like night time?" "No, another period. Like there were the Romans, and now there are the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings." She looked completely baffled. "You know about history, yes?" "You mean the stories in the sagas about our ancestors?" "Not exactly. I was thinking more of the history you learn in school." "What school?" Jo took a deep breath. This was even more difficult than he'd expected. "It's where children go to learn things like reading and writing and numbers." He watched her for any sign of understanding. "Never mind. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I'm from a time that hasn't happened yet in your world." "You mean tomorrow, or next summer, or something?" "Sort of, only much further away. If you think in 10 years' time you'll be grown up. Whereas, well, where I live is over 1,000 years from now." "How many's 1,000? Ah!" He ground the toe of his shoe against the path in frustration. These conversations with Lucy always came to a dead end, because the gap between their worlds was just too big. In fact, it seemed to be worse this time round, because it looked like she had no idea about anything. At least in Roman times, she'd been rich enough to be getting some kind of education. Excuse me. Sorry, I seem to have swallowed a frog today. Hair. At least in Roman times, she'd been rich enough to be getting some kind of education. So she hadn't been asking what school was or how many was 1,000. He sighed. When there was something he didn't understand in her time, he could find out about it on the internet or in a book when he was back at home. but she would never have any idea about his life. He looked up. She had walked on ahead of him. Although she was still carrying the big basket on her back, he could see that her shoulders drooped. "I'm sorry," he said as he caught her up. "I knew it was going to be hard to explain." She didn't answer. "Let's forget it, shall we? Give me one of those baskets to carry." Without looking at him or slowing down, she snapped out her arm with the basket she carried in front of her. He took it and waited to see if she would say something, but it was clear she had decided not to speak to him. For a while they walked in silence. A bitter wind blew across the open countryside. Joe shuddered and tried to think of a way of mending things with Lucy. There was no way of knowing how long he would be here, and he didn't want to waste time arguing. "How are things with Thorbjorn now?" he asked at last, hoping that the mention of their shared enemy might unlock the conversation. For a minute she didn't answer. Joe wondered despondently if they were going to spend the whole day not talking. Then she said, "Actually, I think there might be trouble brewing there." So that's the end of chapter 6. Trouble with Thorbjorn. What is the trouble with Thorbjorn? Could be all sorts of things, as we perfectly well know, because we've met him before. Okay, so same time tomorrow, 5 o'clock. I will try and be on time. I was a bit late today, a bit flustered. But yeah, 5 o'clock tomorrow, and I hope in the meantime you have a nice evening. I'm going to dash off to the post office and post some books to somebody. All right.